I never imagined that terror could live so close to me, so close that I could almost touch it with my hands. It all began in such an insignificant everyday way that I never would have thought it could turn into such a horrible nightmare. But that's how evil sometimes works. It infiltrates routine, disguises itself as normalcy, and when you least expect it, it traps you in its web. My friend Laura and I had been inseparable since high school. I always considered her like a sister, someone I could trust blindly. She lived just a few houses down from mine in a quiet neighborhood in a small town in the United States. We knew each other so well that any change in her behavior was obvious to me, and it was precisely that which alerted me first. It all started subtly. Laura mentioned, almost as a passing complaint, that she had noticed someone following her when she walked home from work. At first, she didn't give it much importance. She thought it was just a coincidence or that maybe she was being overly paranoid. But over time, that feeling of being watched became a constant in her life, a shadow that followed her every step. Laura stopped going out as much as she used to. Her nightly outings became rare and she was always on alert, nervously looking around as if expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was just her imagination, but deep down I felt an unease that I couldn't ignore. What if what she was saying was true? What if there really was someone stalking her? I tried to convince her to go to the police, but Laura was reluctant. She didn't want to seem exaggerated or hysterical. "It's just a feeling," she would tell me, but I could see the fear in her eyes, a fear that grew deeper with each passing day. The situation escalated when one day she found a letter in her mailbox. It wasn't a simple love letter as it might have seemed at first. The words inside were filled with a sick, almost obsessive devotion. The letter detailed aspects of Laura's life that only someone closely following her could know. From what time she left her house to the exact route she took to get to work, everything was recorded with disturbing precision. But what scared her the most was a photograph that came with the letter. It was an image of Laura taken from an angle that made her look completely vulnerable, as if she were trapped in an invisible snare. When Laura showed me the letter, I felt the ground crumble beneath my feet. I tried to stay calm for her, but the knot in my stomach told me that something very bad was about to happen. I tried again to convince her to go to the police, but Laura was convinced they wouldn't take her seriously. "What are they going to do? Search for someone because of a simple letter? I don't even know who it is," she would say, with a tone of resignation that broke my heart. Then, amidst all that chaos, Laura met Mark. He was a kind guy, with a smile that seemed capable of dispelling any storm cloud. They met at a downtown cafe and they quickly started dating. Mark seemed to be just what Laura needed to forget about the stalker. His presence made her smile again, something I hadn't seen in her for weeks. It seemed like the nightmare was over, that the terror had just been a phase that was finally fading away. But that feeling of imminent danger, that premonition that something was terribly wrong, never completely went away. I tried not to worry, but every time Laura mentioned Mark, I felt a twinge of unease that I couldn't ignore, as if something dark was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, while I was at home watching television, I got a call from Laura. Her voice was trembling, filled with panic. I could barely understand what she was saying, but one phrase stood out amidst her confusion. "Mark is dead." The impact of those words left me paralyzed. Mark had been murdered. They found his body in an alley, stabbed multiple times. The police were investigating, but they had no clear leads. Laura was convinced that her stalker was responsible. In her mind, there was no other explanation. She was terrified, certain that it was now her turn, that she would be next. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and fear. Laura disappeared. No one knew where she was. She didn't answer calls, didn't respond to messages. When I went to her house, I found it empty, as if she had vanished into thin air. Her family was devastated, desperate to find her, but every day without news increased the despair. Rumors began to spread around the neighborhood, that Laura had run away, that she was hiding somewhere, that fear had driven her to disappear. I, on the other hand, was completely shattered. I couldn't sleep. Every sound at night made me jump out of bed, and my thoughts grew darker and darker. What if something had happened to Laura? What if I would never see her again? How could I go on without knowing what had happened to her? One night, when insomnia and despair had driven me to the brink of madness, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a hallucination created by exhaustion and fear. but the sounds intensified. They were coming from the house next door, my brother David's house. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking that maybe he had left the television on or was moving something in his basement. But the noises grew louder, more insistent. They were screams, the screams of a woman. My heart stopped for a moment and a wave of panic washed over me. I knew that voice. It was Laura. Without thinking, I ran out of my house, crossing the yard in the dark. My bare feet hit the cold pavement as I ran toward David's house. I pounded on his door with all my might, shouting his name, begging him to open up. The door slowly opened, and there he was, my brother, with an expression on his face that I didn't recognize. There was a mix of fear, desperation, and something else, something dark, something that chilled my blood. I rushed in, pushing him aside, following the screams. I opened the basement door, and what I saw paralyzed me with terror. Laura was there, tied to a chair, her face pale and streaked with tears. The fear in her eyes was palpable, a mix of terror and desperation that I had never seen in her before. My brother was behind her, holding a knife, his face expressionless, as if what he was doing was the most natural thing in the world. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was as if I were in a horror movie, but this time there was no way to stop it or close my eyes. I screamed, trying to reason with David, begging him to let Laura go. But he just stared at me coldly, a coldness I didn't recognize in him. It was as if he wasn't the same person I had known my entire life. At that moment, the horrible truth hit me like a hammer. David had been the stalker from the beginning. He had followed Laura, terrorized her, and now he had killed Mark and kidnapped her. He wasn't the brother I had known all my life, but a stranger, a monster who had been hiding behind a facade of normalcy. The police sirens echoed in the distance, but they weren't arriving fast enough. Laura was on the verge of collapse, and I didn't know what to do. I tried to approach her, but David stopped me, his gaze fixed on me, his face transformed into a mask of hatred. What happened next is a blur in my memory. I remember the screams, the chaos, and then the deafening silence when the officers burst into the house. Laura was taken to the hospital and David was arrested. The blank look on his face as they handcuffed him is an image I will never forget. He showed no emotion, no remorse, only a disturbing calm, as if everything had been part of a plan he had executed to perfection. To this day, David remains in prison, paying for what he did. I visit him from time to time, but he is no longer the same person. I don't even know if he ever was. Laura, for her part, was never the same again. The trauma changed her forever, and the relationship we had faded over time. I'm still here, trying to live my life, but the scars from that night will never go away. For several years, my life had been overshadowed by a persistent presence, a shadow that followed me everywhere, making me feel vulnerable and exposed at every moment. That feeling of being watched, that every one of my steps was being calculated, tormented me day and night. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, a side effect of the horror stories I love to read. But soon, reality set in, and I realized that what I was experiencing was much more than simple paranoia. Fear had become my constant companion, along with the certainty that I was not alone. It all began almost imperceptibly, so subtle that at first, I dismissed it as a series of coincidences. I noticed that someone was following me when I left the university, but always at a prudent distance, just enough for me to doubt my own senses. I walked the same streets I had traveled for years, but somehow those familiar streets had transformed into a threatening labyrinth. The sound of my own footsteps echoed strangely, and the certainty that I was not alone grew with each corner I turned. After several weeks of uncertainty, the signs that something was wrong became more evident. At first they were small things, details that anyone could overlook. Wilted flowers began to appear in my mailbox, along with anonymous letters filled with confusing and seemingly harmless phrases. Every word written in those letters seemed to be imbued with a sick obsession, a devotion that deeply unsettled me. But what disturbed me most wasn't the content of the letters, but the fact that someone was taking the time to write them and leave them in my mailbox. Each of those letters was a reminder that someone knew where I lived, knew my routines, and was determined to make me aware that they were watching me. I tried to ignore those signs, telling myself that they were just pranks, perhaps the work of a bored student or someone trying to scare me. But each day that passed, the situation became more disturbing. The phone calls began to arrive in the middle of the night, always from an unknown number. At first, the voice on the other end of the line said nothing. Only a heavy, disturbing breathing could be heard. That breathing, so close and so intimate, made me feel as if the stalker was right next to me, as if I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. Then the whispers began. At first they were single words, nonsensical phrases that I couldn't understand, but soon the voice began to whisper my name, over and over again, with a mix of lust and contempt that chilled my blood. I didn't recognize the voice, but the way it pronounced my name with a creepy familiarity made me feel that the danger was much closer than I thought. Each call was an invasion of my privacy, a reminder that my stalker was not only close but knew who I was, knew where I lived, and most disturbingly, knew how to terrify me. The helplessness I felt was overwhelming. I went to the police several times, presented the letters, and described the calls, but they couldn't do much without concrete evidence. The officers who attended me were kind, but in their eyes I saw a mix of disbelief and weariness, as if they had heard similar stories hundreds of times. They recommended that I change my routines, not go out alone at night, and always be alert. But those precautions were not enough to calm the fear I felt, a fear that had taken deep root in my soul. Over time, I began to pay more attention to my surroundings, to observe the people who crossed my path. That's when I saw him for the first time. He was a large man, much older than me, with a robust build and a cold expression that gave me goosebumps from the first moment. I had seen him a few times in the neighborhood, walking the streets, always alone, with hunched shoulders and his hands in the pockets of his jacket. I didn't know who he was, but something about the way he walked, the way he watched me from a distance, made me suspect that he was the one responsible for my suffering. As the days passed, my obsession with that man grew. I began to notice small details about him, how he moved, what time he usually appeared on the streets. No matter the time of day, he always seemed to be there, stalking me from the shadows with that empty gaze that made me feel completely vulnerable. I don't know how I knew, but deep down in my soul, something told me that this man was the source of my nightmare. Every time I saw him, a sense of panic overwhelmed me, and simply crossing his path became a challenge for my nerves. One afternoon, after months of constant harassment, everything changed abruptly. I had finished my classes at the university and was walking home as I did every day. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows were lengthening in the deserted streets. I was tired, eager to reach the safety of my home when I saw him. He was standing at the corner of my street, staring at me as if he had been waiting for me all along. My heart raced and a cold sweat ran down my back. I tried to stay calm, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but my legs were trembling uncontrollably. I passed by him without looking directly at him, feeling his gaze boring into my back, as if he could see through my clothes, through my skin, down to my deepest thoughts. I quickened my pace, almost running towards my house, but fear paralyzed me. The key trembled in my hand as I tried to open the door, and I felt that at any moment he could be behind me, catching me before I could escape. When I finally managed to get in, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I didn't dare look out the window. I didn't want to confirm if he was out there, lurking in the darkness. That was the last time I saw him before my life changed forever. That night, after hours of being awake, I finally fell asleep, but my sleep was restless, plagued by nightmares. However, what happened next was not a dream. It was a reality I will never forget. At some point in the early morning, I felt a presence in my room. At first, I thought it was just part of a nightmare, but the fear I felt was too real, too intense to be just a dream. I opened my eyes slowly, my heart pounding, and I saw him. He was there, standing next to my bed, looking at me with those cold, empty eyes that had terrified me for months. Panic completely overtook me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. Before I could react, he lunged at me, covering me with a blanket and roughly gagging me. It all happened in a matter of seconds, so quickly that my mind barely had time to process what was happening. I tried to fight, tried to break free, but he was much stronger than me. I felt a blow to my head and everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a completely unfamiliar place. My hands were tied with a rough rope that chafed my skin, and the pain in my head was unbearable. The room I was in was small, dirty, and barely lit by a flickering bulb on the ceiling, casting sinister shadows on the concrete walls. The walls were covered in mold and dampness, and the air was thick with a nauseating stench, a mix of rot and filth that turned my stomach. The fear I felt was overwhelming. I was completely alone with no idea where I was or how I had gotten there. The only thing I knew for certain was that I was trapped, at the mercy of a man who had been planning this for months, perhaps even years. My thoughts were clouded by pain and terror, but a part of me kept fighting, trying to find a way to escape, to survive this nightmare. It didn't take long for me to realize there was no way out. The bindings on my wrists were so tight that every movement caused unbearable pain, and the headache I felt made it impossible to concentrate. The cement floor was cold and hard, and every time I tried to move, my strength faded a little more. It was as if my body was giving in, surrendering to the despair that enveloped me. It wasn't long before he entered the room. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, the heavy sound of his boots echoing on the cement floor. When he finally appeared in the doorway, his figure seemed even larger and more threatening under the dim light of the bulb. He was barefoot, with dirty clothes and a look of satisfaction on his face, as if he had achieved exactly what he wanted. Panic overwhelmed me again, but there was nothing I could do. I tried to scream, but the gag in my mouth only let out a muffled sound, a faint echo of the despair I felt. He approached slowly, savoring my suffering, my helplessness. His eyes showed no emotion, only a calculated coldness that made me feel like I was an object, a mere tool in his twisted game. Every step he took toward me increased my terror, until he finally stopped right in front of me, looking at me with that empty gaze that had haunted me for so long. The days that followed were pure hell. I don't know how long I was there, whether it was days, weeks, or just endless hours that blended into the darkness. My captor kept me prisoner in that basement, subjecting me to the worst humiliations and tortures. He didn't give me food, only scraps, rotten leftovers that he found somewhere and that were barely edible. I was forced to eat what he gave me, and every bite made me feel like I was losing a little more of my humanity, of my dignity. My strength slowly faded, and the hope of being rescued disappeared with it. There was no way to escape. Every attempt to free myself from my bindings only resulted in more pain and more punishment. He was always there, watching me, making sure I didn't try anything. His eyes never lost that coldness, that indifference that made me feel like my suffering was simply entertainment for him, a macabre game he was determined to win. He asked me questions but didn't respond, only observed my every move, my every reaction as if he were studying a trapped prey. I lost track of time. The hunger, the pain, and the fear slowly consumed me. The hours blurred, the days faded into darkness. I no longer knew if it was day or night, if hours or days had passed since he had captured me. Despair was my only companion, a weight that dragged me deeper and deeper into the darkness. My thoughts began to fade. My mind began to shut down to the reality I was living. Sometimes I found myself wishing it would all end, that the pain and suffering would cease once and for all. But there was something inside me, a small spark of survival that refused to be completely extinguished. It was the only thing that kept me clinging to life, to the hope that somehow someone would find me and rescue me from this nightmare. It was in one of those moments of despair when something changed. One day, as I lay on the floor, too weak to move, I heard a different sound, something I hadn't heard before. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a product of my mind clinging to any sign of hope. But soon I realized I wasn't alone. There was a voice that didn't belong to my captor. I tried to focus, to understand what was happening, but everything was a blur in my mind. Suddenly, the basement door burst open and light flooded in, momentarily blinding me. It was a bright light, different from the dim bulb that had been flickering on the ceiling. My heart raced, and for a moment I thought I was hallucinating. But no, what I was seeing was real. The man who entered was not my captor, but he looked a lot like him. He had the same features, the same robust build, but there was something in his expression, in the way he looked at me, that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, a spark of hope. He was my stalker's brother, someone I had never met, but who at that moment became my savior. Later I learned that he had come to visit his brother, concerned about his increasingly erratic behavior. When he arrived at the house and heard noises coming from the basement, something in him suspected, and he decided to investigate. What he found horrified him, and without thinking twice, he went to get help. The police arrived shortly after, and they took me out of there, weak, dehydrated, and broken in more ways than I can describe. The 2 weeks I spent in that hell changed me forever. My captor was arrested, and although he is now behind bars, the fear and scars he left on me will never disappear. Every day that passes, I keep fighting to rebuild my life, to find a way to move forward. But there are days when I still feel his presence, when I close my eyes and relive every second of that torment. I'm alive, and for that I'm grateful, even if the life I have now is marked by the memory of what happened in that basement. But I know I will never be able to forget, never be able to erase those 2 weeks from my memory. They are a part of me now, a shadow that will follow me forever. I don't remember exactly when it began, but I know that the feeling of being watched became a part of my life long before I admitted it. I was sitting in my living room with the lights off and the TV as the only source of light when I heard the noise again. It wasn't the first time I heard it, but each time it happened, a shiver ran down my spine. It sounded like a whisper, like the sound of someone breathing close, too close. I lived in a quiet neighborhood, in a small town where everyone knew each other, or at least that's what I thought. I never imagined that something like this could happen to me, not in a place where the houses seemed so safe, with well-kept gardens and streetlights illuminating every corner. But there I was, my heart pounding uncontrollably, hearing those strange noises that seemed to come from the walls. It all started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A call in the middle of the night where no one answered on the other end of the line. I thought it was just a prank, some mistake, but then the calls became more frequent. I didn't recognize the number, and every time I tried to call back, it always went to voicemail. I didn't give it much thought until they started leaving messages. At first, they were just breathing sounds, long and ragged, as if someone was trying to hold back. Then the words began. Someone whispered my name. The voice was rough, almost like a growl, and it felt so personal, so intimate that it made my skin crawl. The day I found the first note was when I knew this was much more than just a prank. It was stuck to my front door, written in a messy, almost childlike handwriting. "I see you," it said. 2 simple words, but loaded with a meaning that left me frozen in my doorway. I wanted to think it was a bad joke from some bored teenager, but something inside me knew it was more than that. From that moment, everything changed. It was no longer just a feeling of unease. It was a constant fear that followed me everywhere. I found myself looking over my shoulder when I walked down the street, double-checking that I had locked the door at night, and leaving all the lights on in the house, as if the darkness could give him more power over me. But no matter how much I tried to protect myself, he always found a way to let me know he was there, watching me. One night, while I was trying to fall asleep, I heard something at my bedroom window. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard the creak, the sound of something scratching the glass. I got up slowly, trembling, and with each step I took toward the window, the sound grew louder, more insistent. When I finally mustered the courage to pull back the curtain, there was no one there. But what I saw made me feel as if the ground had opened up beneath my feet. There was a mark on the glass, a streak of something dark and sticky, as if someone had dragged a dirty hand across the window, leaving a grotesque smear, and next to the stain written on the glass was my name. I didn't know what to do. Fear had become a constant part of my life, something I had to deal with daily. I started avoiding going out, fearing he could be anywhere, lurking, waiting. I missed work several times, making up excuses because I couldn't bear the thought of being outside the relative safety of my 4 walls. But it wasn't enough. Despite my efforts to keep myself safe, he always found a way to remind me that I wasn't alone. Once, after coming home from visiting a friend, I found a picture of me on the dining table. It wasn't just any picture. It was an image of me sleeping, taken from the side of my bed. The angle, the lighting, everything indicated that the photo had been taken from inside my room while I was unconscious. The thought that he had been that close, that silent, made me feel sick. It wasn't until that night that I finally decided to contact the police. I told them everything, every little detail, every call, every note, every sign that someone had been inside my house. They took my report and assured me they would investigate, but deep down I knew they couldn't do much. There was no concrete evidence, just a series of events that could easily be dismissed as coincidences or cruel pranks. Time passed and things got worse. I started noticing things missing in my house. Small things, insignificant at first, like a comb or a coffee cup. But then more important things disappeared, like my underwear and a childhood photograph. It was as if he was trying to erase my identity, little by little, until there was nothing left of me. The most terrifying moment came when I received a package at my doorstep. It had no return address or sender, just my name in large red letters. Inside there was a single object, a knife, sharp and shiny, with a small note that said soon. That was the last time I left my house without feeling that danger was waiting for me around every corner. And then one day, he simply disappeared. The calls stopped, the notes ceased, and there were no more signs that he had been in my house. I don't know what stopped him, whether he got tired of me or found another victim, but the feeling of relief was fleeting. The fear never really went away. It follows me everywhere, in every shadow, in every unexpected noise. I still double-check that the door is locked. I still look over my shoulder when I walk alone, because I know he's still out there, somewhere, waiting, watching. And I know that someday, maybe soon, he'll come back. During my first year of college in New Hampshire, a girl in my dorm accidentally caused a small fire in the dormitory by leaving popcorn in the microwave for too long. Around 3 in the morning, we all had to evacuate. The fire trucks arrived, and the emergency teams made a huge fuss about it. The girl who caused the fire was the subject of a lot of teasing, and I felt bad for her because she wasn't really attractive and seemed pathetically alone. Besides, causing a microwave fire seemed like a pretty innocent mistake to receive such harsh comments for. A couple of days after the incident, I saw her in the dining hall and struck up a casual conversation, asking her how things were going, just checking in because I felt bad for her. She laughed, and that was it, a conversation that lasted about 2 minutes. Fast forward a week, and I hear a knock on my door, and it's the same girl, whom I'll now call Popcorn. She literally runs into my room without hesitation. I hadn't even told her my room number, and at that moment, I just thought she had seen me go in there once because she didn't even know my name at that point. It takes me a second to realize that she's crying her eyes out. Now there's a stranger crying on my bed, and I'm just like... So feeling sorry for her as the soft-hearted person I am, I ask her what's wrong. She tells me that one of the cooks in the dining hall sexually assaulted her, and that the university wouldn't fire him, and she was emotionally suffering because of it. Being a victim of assault myself, I really sympathized with her situation and gave her my phone number in case she needed help walking to the dining hall with a safety net and things like that. I don't take sexual assault lightly. The night after our conversation in my room, I received a call from her asking me to accompany her to the dining hall because the same cook who had assaulted her was working that day. I accompanied her to get food, and she lit up like a firefly, and a completely new person emerged. It didn't matter that her assailant was in the room. She talked nonstop about Pretty Little Liars, One Direction, etc., a bunch of things I really wasn't interested in. But again, she had no one to talk to, and the situation was complicated. I just listened and nodded. Over the course of about 2 weeks, I accompanied her to the dining hall maybe 4 or 5 times. She might have been a victim of assault, but she was also very annoying and unattractive. Good God, she even talked about herself in the third person. Her story about the assault became inconsistent, and there were always new major developments about what had happened, and then the story changed to something much more drastic and severe. It went from an assault to a gang entrance to do the same thing to her. Then she made a comment one day along the lines of how she wished someone would throw a bomb and kill all the people of the same race as her assailant so they could stop him. That immediately made me uncomfortable and uneasy. I didn't want to accompany her or interact with her anymore. During Thanksgiving break, I went home to visit my family while Popcorn stayed on campus. During that week, I had 60 missed calls from Popcorn. One day I even had 20 calls over the course of a few hours. No normal person does that. The red flags were definitely up if they hadn't been already. When I returned to campus, there was a knock on my door, and sure enough, it was Popcorn crying again. She tells me that because I wasn't on campus to protect her, she was assaulted by another guy while walking to Panera Bread, and the Filipino RA groped and hit her. If the red flags were up before, this was a full-blown alarm. I'm not one to excuse sexual assault, but the proportion of sexual assaults was incredibly high, especially since these 3 incidents happened over the course of a month, all by seemingly random people of color. She was making up these stories to get some sick form of sympathy, and as a real victim of assault, I was more than offended. I told her I had to go to class and ran away from her to seek advice from a friend. The situation became really crazy, really fast. I warned the RA offices about her, and they said they would talk to her. During class, I had over 100 missed calls and a series of individual messages that only said hi. I was done with this. I didn't want anything to do with her. I blocked her number and went back to my dorm. That week, after classes, I would just go straight to my dorm. I didn't want to see her. One day I had to go to the bathroom, so I went into a stall to do my business. I was casually there, peeing with my pants around my ankles, when Popcorn literally crawled across the bathroom floor and peeked her head under the stall and said, I knew you'd come out eventually." I was totally freaked out and almost on the verge of tears. I told her that I was extremely busy and didn't have time for her, and that I was upset about her invading my privacy. That took a lot of courage because I have serious issues with confrontation. She tells me how she's thinking about killing herself because her mother died when she was young. Some manipulation I just wasn't in the mood to deal with. I left her in the bathroom and went to my room and locked the door. I watched some YouTube videos and took a nap when I was abruptly awakened, not by knocks on the door but by loud banging. I didn't answer, and the banging continued and grew louder and louder. "Open this door or I'll kill you. Open the door or I'll kill you." That went on endlessly. She just waited outside my dorm singing songs through the door cracks for an hour. I was so scared that I just cried and called my dad to pick me up from school. I didn't have many friends who lived on campus, as it was a small college and a lot of people commuted, and this whole situation made me feel isolated. My mental health was rapidly deteriorating. The RAs had been informed about the threats made at my door by other students who witnessed what was happening, and she was given a warning, but that was it. One night, my boyfriend, who lived 3 hours away at the time, came to spend the night at the university. We were watching a movie and then fell asleep in my bed when suddenly we heard the door open. Like an idiot, I'd completely forgotten to lock the door. Popcorn comes running in and jumps on us, saying in a baby voice, "Popcorn wants cuddles." I was more than scared and basically screamed. My boyfriend, being a no-tolerance and confrontational person, told her to get the hell out of my room. She said yes, and I quote, "I'll just go and die like my mom did when I was 3 and inject cancer into myself." My boyfriend smiled and said, "Good," and then pushed her out of the room and slammed the door without a care. I swear he almost closed the door on her fingers. We reported her to campus police in the morning, and still, nothing major happened until there was another fire caused by Popcorn in her dorm, and shortly afterward she was expelled. I wish that was where the story ended, but with her, unfortunately, it didn't. After she was kicked out of the dorms, my dorm life became much easier. I made a lot of new normal friends, and I felt much less anxious. One day, a girl in one of my classes invited me to go to the mall with her to get our nails done. Now, this nail salon had clear windows so you could see the rest of the mall while getting your nails done. I was all relaxed when suddenly I saw Popcorn's face pressed against the glass of the nail salon, and she was with a morbidly obese man. I'm getting my nails done, and she's staring at me through the window for a good 10 minutes with this man. Saying I was uneasy would be an understatement. I told my friend what was going on, and we ran out of there, and they tried to follow us. In hindsight, that was the moment I should have called the police for real. After the mall, I received a bunch of friend requests from profiles with a small Yorkie dog as the profile picture and several message requests. I opened them, and they were all from Popcorn, asking me to be her maid of honor at a wedding at Pizza Hut that she and her fiancé were going to have in 2 years. You can't make this stuff up. There was another message about how she was so upset that I hadn't recognized her at the mall, and that she had waited so long to introduce me to her dear fiancé, and that she was so upset she wanted to strangle me. Of course, I blocked all those profiles, and things were pretty quiet after that. I've been living with my boyfriend and going to school in Rhode Island for 2 years now. I love school, and I have an excellent group of friends. About 5 months ago, I had some homework to do and received 3 missed calls from a random New Hampshire number. Thinking it was one of my relatives, I called back, and no, it was Popcorn on the other end. I immediately hung up. There was also a voicemail left, which was just someone breathing into the phone and telling me that I was expected to be at the wedding. I cried and urgently called the police about the number. I don't know what happened or if anything ever did, but I haven't been bothered since. I'm a very kind person, and people often take advantage of my openness. It really is a fatal flaw that I'm working hard on. It's unfortunate that there are so many unbalanced and lonely people, but we really shouldn't make it our burden to help them. Sometimes being kind actually causes a lot of mental stress. To popcorn, let's never meet again. I wouldn't have thought all this was possible, but I just discovered something through a photo in a random post from an account I don't even follow, where two people in the background make me question everything that happened almost a decade ago. But I can't tell you what happened without going back to when I thought everything in my life was perfect. Let's start by choosing fake names, as I usually do to maintain anonymity. I'll call my family the Johnsons. It's generic enough. I'll call my husband Faustino, my daughter Lucia, and you can think of me as Linda. After years of living in a 2-bedroom apartment, we bought a small house just 15 minutes outside the city, but kept our jobs in the city, choosing to commute every day. Suddenly, we were the perfect American family. We had a yard, and maybe my daughter could finally get that big dog she'd always asked for. The commute wasn't great, but it was amazing to sleep in that house for the first time and not hear anything except the hooting of an owl or something like that. The day after we moved in, even the neighbors greeted us. They were friendly. One brought a cake, and I shuddered a bit after they left, but only because I'd seen too many horror movies and true crime documentaries. Something felt suspicious. It was too perfect, you know. The first thing I did after settling into a new routine was to get my daughter that big dog. He was a rescue dog, and he became part of our family pretty quickly. He hardly barked and was happy at home. I've always felt that animals can sense things we can't, so I trusted that everything was fine. After a few weeks of this sort of perfection, I even hosted a small barbecue party to invite the neighbors. That dog was fine with all of them, and we'll call him Rover, so I set aside the panic and paranoia and got used to living in this area. I made friends with some people and found out that many had kids around my daughter's age. Although I was a working mom, I got involved in some school activities. I didn't have time to become a classroom mom or anything like that, but I was much more present. One weekend, my mother-in-law came to visit. We'll call her Karina. She's nice enough, not too critical, and my husband adored her, but she lived on the other side of the country. She hated the city, but once she saw our new house, she promised to visit more often. Money was never really an issue for her. We lived modestly because my husband insisted on being independent, but his widowed mother was quite well off. During another weekend with Karina, I was in the kitchen making sandwiches for lunch when she suddenly yanked me toward the front window. She asked who that was and pointed at the neighbor's house across the street. I told her it was our neighbor David. I estimated David was about 20 years older than my husband and me. My mother-in-law went a little quiet, and I asked what was wrong. She said David was watching our house too closely. I laughed a little because there was no way. David wasn't the most sociable guy, but he didn't give off bad vibes, and Rover liked him too. I told her that, and Karina rolled her eyes, saying you couldn't always trust a dog's reaction. Well, I knew that. I wasn't dumb, but I didn't have any bad feelings. So I just patted her on the shoulder and went back to the sandwiches. We went for a walk around the neighborhood a few hours later, partly to walk Rover and partly so Karina could see other houses and the place in general. She said it was almost exactly like her neighborhood, and was pleased that Lucia could finally have the childhood experience she really needed. And I was happy at that moment. You don't always get that lucky with in-laws. Lucia was walking a little ahead with Rover when suddenly Karina grabbed my arm. She said someone was following us. I looked around and saw David walking on the other side of the street. I told her he was just taking a walk like we were. Other neighbors were also walking their pets, and it almost looked like a Norman Rockwell picture if you've ever seen one of those. But my mother-in-law shook her head. She said no, she thought the same thing, but he had been walking alongside us since we left. I told her it was okay, let's just go back home, and she nodded, gripping my arm tighter and urging me to catch up with Lucia and Rover. When we were a few steps from the house, she said, "Look, now he's turning back because we're turning back." I looked at David, who was staring intently at the concrete, and I considered it. We had been in the neighborhood for a while, and I hadn't noticed anything, and I was the queen of paranoia at first. I told Karina that I would also pay attention and thanked her for letting me know. I think she was glad I took her seriously at that moment, and we went inside and forgot about it for the night. In the days that followed, Karina decided to extend her visit. It wasn't a bad thing, though I would have preferred her to leave as usual. Sometimes you're just not in the mood for company. But Karina cooked and spent time with Lucia after school, and Faustino and I worked, so I let it go. It was better for Lucia to have someone at home. I worried that she might want to move in with us, but I didn't want to start a fight. I came home from work one night, and Karina had something on the stove that smelled really good. But when she saw me, she turned off the gas, taking me outside, saying she had to talk to me. I asked what was going on this time, and she said David had been lurking around. I asked what she meant, and she said the neighbor had checked our mailbox, walked up on the porch, and even tried to look through the window. Then Rover started barking, and he left. I asked why she hadn't opened the door and questioned what he was doing. She looked at me as if I had asked her to strip naked in the middle of a shopping mall. "I can't do that," she said. I was alone. Who knows what he was up to? I could only sigh and calm her down. We went back inside. Faustino came home and we had dinner. That night, I told my husband about the situation with David. He trusted his mother and got worried, and we talked about getting cameras. But honestly, he and I could be considered experts in procrastination when it came to things like that, so we never bought them. I wish we had. It would have saved us a lot of trouble. Anyway, Karina left a few weeks later, and I promised myself I'd pay attention to David. One afternoon, he was watering his plants when I got home. A few minutes later, I heard Faustino's car and looked out the window. David was at his mailbox, waved at Faustino, who waved back, and that was it. But I noticed something else. I asked Faustino if he had lost our photo from our first beach vacation with Lucia. She was a baby in it. I had framed it and kept it in our living room since we moved from the apartment, and he hadn't lost it. I asked Lucia, who looked at me curiously, as preteens do, and shook her head, but the photo was gone. I searched the house and found nothing, so I gave in and called Karina to ask if she had moved it. She immediately jumped to accusations. "David must have broken into your house. He took advantage of my absence," she said. "I really shouldn't have called her. I knew what would happen." In the days that followed, Karina booked a flight and told us she'd be staying here for a while, and I really hated that she assumed our neighbor was the culprit without any proof. Faustino thought it was a good idea so that Lucia wouldn't have to be alone if we had a possible stalker or something, and I couldn't argue with that logic. So I had to live with my mother-in-law. No matter how much you love your in-laws, you really don't want to live with them permanently. Every day, I had to come home and get a full report on what David was doing. Karina wanted to find out more about him because although David attended neighborhood parties and all that, he wasn't the most talkative, so we didn't know much about him except that he lived alone. Not everyone has to be a social person, but Karina wouldn't give up. I asked around, and most neighbors didn't know much either except for a woman in her 60s who lived a few blocks away. If you think this woman was a typical grandmother, you'd be wrong. I'll call her Claudine. She didn't look a day over 45 and was the life of the party wherever she went. She drank like a fish but could hold her liquor, and you'd never see her drunk, even after downing an entire bottle of wine. But after drinking, she got talkative, and I approached her at a Halloween event. She was the only person there without kids, so she had already poured herself some wine, but I talked about myself and asked about life. She was a great career woman and a world traveler. I guess we had that in common. After about 2 hours, I asked her about David, trying to be a bit sneaky about it. She didn't notice anything strange and launched into telling me what she knew. Apparently, David had lost his wife and daughter many years ago. He wasn't as old as she was, but this had happened long before my daughter was born. Claudine said that since their deaths, David remained a good neighbor and would help others in a second, but he wasn't the vibrant or talkative person others knew. He was the life of the party once, she told me, and I nodded as she explained more. Then we got distracted by the party and other people. I went home and talked to my husband, telling him that I really didn't think David was doing anything wrong. We couldn't suspect someone of stalking or worse when he was just an older and lonely person. Faustino agreed with me, and for some reason I asked him not to tell his mother. I didn't want her to know what I had discovered. Unfortunately, when I got home from work the next day, I saw Karina yelling at David. She was at the edge of our front yard while David was at the edge of his. I got out of the car and heard her shouting, "Never go near my son and his family again." "What's going on?" I asked, and Karina turned to me with a red face and veins in her neck about to burst, saying, "I can't believe you didn't tell me what you heard about him. It all makes sense. He's trying to get a new family, yours." "What?" I asked again because it was so ridiculous, but she insisted, accusing David of lurking around again. My neighbor had the most confused look in the world, and I just took my mother-in-law inside the house. I gave her a very serious talk and told her I wouldn't tolerate such crazy behavior when we were doing so well in our new neighborhood. Karina tried to protest and I just shut her up. I scolded my husband later for telling her what we had discussed, but he said his mother needed to know. I was too tired after a long day at work to keep fighting with him about this, and the weekend was approaching. Lucia had a school play on Saturday night, and other parents who lived nearby would be attending. I warned him that if he and Karina wanted to come, she needed to keep it together. Saturday came, and I arrived early to see if the classroom moms needed any more help and chatted with them. Karina had been as well behaved as she knew how to be since I scolded her, so I saved seats for both of them. They didn't show up. My daughter didn't have a big role, but Faustino wasn't the type of dad to miss these things, and Karina was a good grandmother. Honestly, I was puzzled at that moment. I didn't know what to say to Lucia when the play ended, and neither of them was there to congratulate her, so I said goodbye to the people after taking a bunch of pictures, and we left. I apologized to my daughter on the way home, and she shrugged. She did that a lot as she got closer to adolescence, but I knew she was disappointed. At least I was furious inside. If this absence had anything to do with my mother-in-law's crazy obsession with this guy David, I was going to explode. I just didn't know that our lives were about to change completely. When we got home, "Mom, the front door is open," Lucia said as I parked. "What?" I looked, and she was right, and that wasn't normal for us, so I told her to stay in the car for a few minutes. I entered my house slowly, and it was chaos. My coffee table was upside down. My grandmother's old lamp was broken on the floor. Some of the photos on my wall were crooked, and others were on the floor as well. I went further in, calling for Faustino and Karina, and no one answered. I felt my hand shaking as I took out my phone and dialed my husband's number. It kept ringing as I walked deeper into my house, and suddenly I heard it, his ringtone. I burst open our bedroom door and saw a big mess, but Faustino's phone was on the nightstand on his side of the bed. I called Karina, and I heard her ringtone coming from the guest room we had turned into her room. I dialed 911 after that. I didn't know if it was too early to call them, but my pristine house was a wreck, and my husband and mother-in-law were gone. The police arrived and inspected things, and that's when I remembered Rover. He was also missing. I told them what I could while keeping my arms around Lucia, who was crying into my stomach. Answering the police's questions was hard, but one was particularly complicated. The officer said, "Have your mother-in-law or husband had any arguments with anyone lately?" And that was the first time I really suspected David. After weeks of Karina's comments, I thought maybe I should have listened, so I told them my mother-in-law was convinced the neighbor was a stalker. I had to tell them what I had heard from Claudine and what Karina had theorized, but I emphasized that I wasn't too sure. I didn't want to get him in trouble for no reason, and speaking of neighbors, some had gathered, including some of the moms who had seen me at the play, but David wasn't around. A police officer went to his door and quickly returned, saying no one was home. That really made things worse because, in my heart, I told myself I should have been more careful. The police left, promising to start an investigation and asking me to call them if I found anything new. But I couldn't stay in my house, putting my daughter at risk, so we packed some things and went to a hotel. Claudine called me the next morning and asked what had happened. As I mentioned, she lives a few blocks away, so she wouldn't have seen the police's flashing lights. I told her along with my suspicions, and surprisingly, she said David would never have anything to do with it, and she was sure of it. I told her he wasn't home either, and she said he slept at her house. No one knew they were together. The age difference was hard to digest for some people, she said, and I was stunned. I never imagined it, but it made sense. Looking back, we were near Claudine's house when David was walking alongside us while we were walking Rover, and Karina made some of her first accusations, but he turned around when he did. That was a while ago. I asked Claudine, and she said their relationship had only been going on for a few months, so the timeline matched. So what could have happened to my husband and mother-in-law if David wasn't the problem? I never found out at all. After a few days at the hotel, I returned home with Lucia, and David even spoke to me, offering to help if the police were looking for something, and I thanked him. The police also spoke to him, and I think they quickly cleared him of any suspicion. They conducted searches with trained dogs and all that afterward. They searched Karina's out-of-state house, and it was perfect, but no one had been there for a while. No security cameras had picked up anything. They had no leads, nothing until they found a dead rescue dog on a farm 2 hours away, and his tag had my dog's name on it. They wouldn't have paid attention to it if my husband and mother-in-law's disappearance hadn't been so strange. One of the original officers told me I had to prepare myself and my daughter. because it was very likely that Faustino and his mother were no longer alive. It wasn't easy, but I realized my strength then. I stayed strong for my daughter, pushing us to get back to some semblance of normal life while the police did their work. And time passed, and the strange normal became our real normal, and the case went cold. No bodies. Once again, nothing. Years went by, and Lucia entered her teenage years. She was having a hard time in high school, so I just couldn't wait any longer. We had to leave. We moved hours away to a much sunnier area surrounded by beaches, and I saw Lucia thrive. I did too. As hard as it is to confess, moving away was the only right thing for us. More years passed, and Lucia graduated from high school and went to college. She's about to graduate, and I'm very proud of her, so I was planning a pretty big trip abroad. Do you remember when I mentioned earlier about the post on a random account I don't follow? The one that changed our lives. You know how your phone just knows things now, like if you're thinking about buying a new swimsuit and suddenly you get ads for swimwear. I know there's some kind of computerized explanation here, but that's not the point. This is about the photo that made me question everything. It's been a long time, but I would recognize him anywhere. Faustino was in the background of that photo, and I know people have lookalikes, but Karina was with him. Her face was as clear as day, even if they were behind some model in a swimsuit. I checked the account. It was a swimsuit brand, of course, and they had several models in different pieces but on the same street. I tried to look for other photos of them, but there was nothing, which means they must have passed by while the brand was doing their photo shoot or something like that. So my husband and mother-in-law, who had disappeared from our lives almost 10 years ago and were considered dead, were suddenly perfectly fine on the streets of some European country known for its art and good food. Maybe I'm going crazy. Maybe it's been too long. But what happened? Why did they leave? Was it planned? Did they kill my dog? I wish I knew, and I'm not sure if I should tell Lucia or anyone else. I never thought that someone so close to me could be capable of something so terrifying. The truth is, it was very hard for me to accept what was happening, and even harder to face the fact that the stalker was in my own home, watching me without my knowledge. My name is Teresa, and this is my story. It all started with something seemingly harmless, an anonymous letter. It was an ordinary afternoon when I came home from university. The day had been long and tiring, and I felt relieved to get home. My mother was at work, and I had the house to myself. As I was going through the mail, I found an envelope with no return address. When I opened it, I discovered a handwritten letter with elegant but unsettling handwriting. The content was strange, a short message that read, "I see you more than you imagine." There was no signature, just that disturbing phrase. At first, I tried not to give it too much importance. I thought it might be a bad joke or even a letter meant for someone else. But what started as a small shock soon turned into something much more disturbing. In the following days, I began to receive more letters. They were similar to the first, with increasingly personal messages mentioning details about my daily life that no one should know. My mother at first was concerned, but since the letters didn't contain direct threats, we didn't want to alarm ourselves too much. Soon the letters were accompanied by gifts, small objects that seemed harmless at first, a bracelet, a scarf, and similar things. The most unsettling part was that often these gifts seemed to be items I had already seen in my house. At first I thought I might have misplaced some of my things and that someone was returning them. But then, photos began to arrive. I received a black and white photo of myself in the kitchen, clearly taken from an angle that couldn't have been captured by someone from the street. The photo was sharp and detailed, showing parts of the kitchen that only someone inside the house could have seen. My stomach churned as I realized the stalker had access to my home. Terror gripped me when I started receiving even more invasive photos. Images of my bedroom, pictures of my bed and my desk. The photos were clearly taken from inside the house. The first time I saw one of these images, I froze. The photo showed a view of my desk where I had left some books and a cup of coffee. There was no way someone could have taken that picture without being inside the house. A chill ran through my body as I realized that someone was entering my personal space without my knowledge. I tried talking to my mother about what was happening, but she seemed skeptical. She thought it might be someone playing a cruel joke on me or an unwanted admirer. But things got worse. The invasion of my privacy became increasingly evident. I started finding objects in places where I hadn't left them, as if someone was moving my things to spy on me. One night after I came back from a dinner with some friends, I found a letter in my room. This time, the letter contained a disturbing message. "Your clothes look so pretty on you, I'm glad you wear them." Attached to the letter was a photo of one of my favorite shirts, clearly taken while it was hanging in my closet. I was absolutely panicked, knowing that someone had been in my room while I wasn't there. The situation reached a critical point when I began to notice missing objects and clothes. One afternoon, while I was home alone, I heard a noise in my bedroom. I approached slowly, trying to be stealthy. When I opened the door, I found someone in my room taking pictures. My heart stopped at that moment. The intruder realized I was there and, with a look of surprise and fear, fled. That's when I realized it was someone I knew. My stepfather's brother, Jorge. Jorge had always been an occasional presence in my life, as I only saw him when he visited my stepfather. He was a distant but seemingly harmless figure. However, his presence in my room taking pictures of my underwear was a devastating blow. I felt a mixture of shame and terror as I realized he had been the one behind all of this. I immediately called my mother and told her what had happened. She was in shock, and although it was hard for her to believe at first, the evidence was undeniable. The situation became even more complicated when Jorge, realizing he had been caught, tried to downplay the situation and deny his guilt. However, the truth was clear. My mother, devastated by the betrayal, decided to distance herself from my stepfather. The relationship between them became unsustainable, and eventually, my mother decided to end it. Jorge disappeared from our lives and we never saw him again. The feeling of being invaded by someone so close and trusted was deeply unsettling. The betrayal and fear left a lasting mark on me, and although I tried to move on, the experience changed me forever. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild my life and regain a sense of normalcy. My mother and I moved to a new place, and although the experience left scars, I tried to leave the fear and insecurity behind. Despite everything, the memory of that period and the sense of vulnerability still linger in my mind. What I never imagined could happen to me, such an intimate and terrifying invasion, taught me to value my safety and be cautious about whom I trust.